Look at this painting. For thousands of years, the blue pigment used here was worth more than gold. That's because it all came from a single source, this rock, the Lapis Lazuli. It's only found in the remote and inaccessible mountains of modern-day Afghanistan.
This is a piece of Lapis Lazuli that's come from the one mountain in Afghanistan.
For 6,000 years, this rock was the only way to make the color blue. It built trade routes, nearly bankrupted Michelangelo, and even armed the Taliban. This is the story of the Lapis Lazuli and how it held the world hostage. To understand why the color blue was such a big deal, we have to understand the visible light spectrum. You probably remember it from high school. The more to the left of the spectrum the color is, the more energy it requires. And for millions of years, nature decided that blue was chemically too expensive to manufacture. Oh, and purple too, but that's a different story.
There aren't many blue things in nature, so this must have been a spectacular thing to display and to find.
You might think, well, what about the sky or the ocean? Aren't they blue? It's true they appear blue, but it's an illusion of physics rather than a substance of chemistry. The air particles in the sky scatter sunlight, and the ocean reflects the sky and absorbs red light, so it looks blue. But if you take ocean water into a cup, it's clear. For thousands of years, civilization looked around and saw blue everywhere. Yet when they tried to capture that color on a canvas, they couldn't. This is why Lapis Lazuli was a miracle. It was a geological anomaly. More importantly, it was the only stable source of blue pigment in the entire world. To trace the origins of this rock, we have to go back to 4000 BC, to ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians didn't just wear this stone. They engineered it into the world's first data authentication tool, the cylinder seal. Because lapis is hard enough to hold incredibly intricate, non-forgeable carvings, these seals were rolled across wet clay to create unique signatures or stamps. This made lapis seal the ultimate security key. But the Sumerians weren't the only ones who were obsessed with this rock. This is King Tutankhamun's death mask. The eyes and eyebrows are made from genuine lapis. But the real lapis was so scarce that even a pharaoh had to use an imitation glass for the large stripes on the headdress. Because to get the stone, the Egyptians had to rely on a supply chain that stretched almost 3,000 miles from the Nile, all the way back to those same mountains in Afghanistan. Even though they were arguably the most powerful empire on earth, which could build pyramids and control the Nile, they were still completely dependent on foreign trade for their most sacred color. By 1300 BC, this rock had essentially become the first international luxury market. Even the pharaohs had to pay a monopoly price. Fast forward a few thousand years, and the rock finally arrives in the Rialto district in Venice. The Italians called it ultramarino, or the blue from beyond the sea. The color that was made from this rock was eventually called ultramarine blue. So one thing to note is that by the time lapis reaches Europe, it wasn't a rock anymore. It was a powder in most cases. And this is where the economics start to get a bit crazy. Okay, let's go back a bit. To reach the painters of the Renaissance, the journey starts here, the Sarisang mines in Afghanistan, 11,000 feet above sea level. A miner risks his life on a vertical cliff face to extract the lapis lazuli from the mountain. He sells a sack of it for pennies to a caravan driver. This caravan driver battles the snow, bandits, and altitude to carry the stone hundreds of miles west along the Great Khorasan Road to arrive in Tabriz in Iran. Here, the rocks are consolidated and sold to a merchant. The merchant marks up the price and pushes the shipment towards the border of the rival empire, the Ottomans. The Ottoman Turks held the keys to Europe. They taxed every ounce of stone that passes through their ports. By the time the rock leaves the dock, the price has already tripled. The rocks are brought by Venetian traders to Europe. So that means 6,000 miles, 7 middlemen for just one color. And it's here in the markets of Venice that the Vendecolori buy the lapis. They were color sellers, part chemist, part merchants. They knew you couldn't simply crush the rock. Crushing lapis produces a gray powder. You had to use a secret chemical process involving wax and lye to extract the pure blue lazurite from the impurities. It's a chemical nightmare. A kilogram of rock produces just about 30 to 50 grams of blue pigment. The labor was so intense and the supply chain was so long that by the Renaissance, the color ultramarine blue was literally worth its weight in gold. And here's the catch. the painters had to buy it. The Catholic Church had decreed that the Virgin Mary must be painted using ultramarine blue. So if you were the painter in the 15th century in Europe, you were trapped. You were forced to buy a pigment that you couldn't afford from a supply chain that you didn't control. It got so bad that Michelangelo allegedly left the entombment unfinished because he literally couldn't pay for the pigment. Or more accurately, his patrons couldn't pay for it. Because let's be honest, it wasn't the artist funding these pigments. It was the new banking dynasties of Europe. Families like the Medici in Florence. In fact, the Medici were so obsessed with the material that it didn't just use it for paint. They built entire workshops just to carve raw lapis into priceless vases and tables. The Lapis Lazuli monopoly on blue pigment lasted about 6,000 years, but it couldn't survive the Industrial Revolution. Post-Napoleonic France was bleeding money. They were paying 5 times the price of gold for this blue dust, funneling national wealth to Venetians and Ottoman middlemen. And since France was trying to position itself as a global leader in art and luxury, the government decided that this wasn't just a mere inconvenience for artists, it was an issue of national security. So they issued a challenge: 6,000 francs to anyone who could synthesize the color ultramarine blue. In 1828, a chemist named Jean-Baptiste Guimet cracked the code. He realized lapis wasn't magic. It was sulfur, soda ash, and clay baked in an oven. And suddenly, you had synthetic ultramarine blue. Overnight, the price of the blue pigment collapsed 99%. The luxury monopoly was finally broken, and by chemical engineering no less. But the story of the Lapis Lazuli didn't end in Guimet's lab. Yes, the pigment market may have died, but the gemstone market, well, that was very much alive and thriving. See, the thing is, Guimet's invention was a powder that you could use for paint, but you couldn't use it to carve a statue or jewelry. In fact, the lapis went from being a raw material to being a finished good thereafter. Cartier and Fabergé used the stone in its purest form extensively in their luxury products. And ironically, because the synthetic ultramarine blue was so clean, uniform, flat, and consistent, it actually made it less desirable than the natural lapis, which had imperfections and impurities. Those imperfections were the eventual proof of luxury. This transition to a finished good created yet another market for the lapis, the black market. Since the stone held its value outside the banking system, it became the perfect currency for illegal trade.
Leading the Panjshir Mujahideen was a 28-year-old commander, Ahmed Shah Massoud. With no support from the US, he managed the impossible. He resisted the Red Army, reputedly the most powerful force in the world.
During the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, the resistance commander Ahmed Shah Massoud faced a critical problem. He needed to sustain an army of thousands to fight the Soviets. But you can't just wire money to guerrillas in the mountains. So he utilized the only liquid asset he had, the ancient mines within his territory. He used the Lapis Lazuli as hard currency, generating the cash he needed to keep his resistance alive.
A valley in the northeast of the country. They had to fend for themselves, doing whatever they could to secure weapons.
The CIA might have supplied the missiles, but the Lapis Lazuli supplied the army. This established the mines as a critical strategic asset. It proved that an insurgency could survive without the banking system if they held the right territory.
2 North Africans, with Belgian passports and a letter of introduction from an Islamic group in London, persuaded Massoud to give them an interview. They began with some unexpected questions. Why are you against Osama bin Laden? Why do you call him a killer? Each exploded a bomb, one in the camera and the other in a suicide belt. Massoud was dead.
So after the Taliban assassinated Massoud in 2001, the region was thrown into chaos. For years, the mines were just a free-for-all. By 2014, the Taliban seized the roads leading up to the mines. At its peak, the Taliban earned $20 million a year just by taxing the convoys coming from the mines. The stone of the pharaohs became the blood diamond of Afghanistan. Today, the supply chain has gone dark. The stone is smuggled into Pakistan, polished in India, and sold in Hong Kong. Legally, it's become a toxic asset, a conflict mineral that major brands refuse to touch. The story of the Lapis Lazuli serves as a stark reminder that a single-source supply chain is rarely sustainable. For 6,000 years, the world depended on one supplier, and that dependency shaped the map. Much of the geopolitical dynamics we see today can be viewed through the same lens. When a resource is both essential and scarce, trade stops being just commerce, and it becomes the primary driver of conflict. So the next time you see a blue sky in a Renaissance painting, don't just see a color. See a stone that funded empires, bankrupted artists, and armed rebellions. See the beautiful, bloody price of the color blue.